In the long history of crime and mystery, few cases have gripped Britain like this one. A brutal murder, an aristocrat accused, and a disappearance that has never been solved. On the night of November 7th, 1974, the nanny of an upper-class household was savagely killed. Her employer, Lady Veronica Lucan, was left bloodied but alive, and her husband, Lord Lucan, vanished without a trace. What followed was not just a murder investigation, but the birth of one of the greatest mysteries of the 20th century. A man of title, wealth, and privilege gone in an instant, leaving behind only rumors, theories, and speculation. To this day, people still ask, did Lord Lucan take his own life, or was he spirited away by friends in high places? This could be the biggest disappearance in British history, and tonight we're telling the full story. The story of Lord Lucan begins not in the shadows of crime, but in the glittering halls of privilege. Richard John Bingham, born on 18th of December 1934, was the very picture of aristocracy. Tall, handsome, and effortlessly charming, he belonged to one of Britain's oldest families, holding the title of the 7th Earl of Lucan. From a young age, Lucan lived a life that most could only dream of. After his education at Eton College, he completed national service with the Coldstream Guards before taking his place in London's elite circles. In the smoky clubs of Mayfair and Belgravia, he quickly became a familiar face, well-dressed, confident, and always with a smile. But behind the charm, there was another side. Lucan developed an obsession with gambling, particularly backgammon and poker. He earned the nickname Lucky Lucan after a string of big wins, but luck, as history would later prove, is fickle. His nights were often spent at the exclusive Clermont Club, rubbing shoulders with politicians, actors, and the wealthy elite. To outsiders, Lucan's life was the stuff of fairy tales, an earl with status, wealth, and charisma. In 1963, he married Veronica Duncan, a woman who seemed the perfect match. Together, they moved into a grand home in London's upscale Belgravia district, raising 3 children and living the life of a glamorous couple. But appearances can be deceiving. Beneath the surface of wealth and elegance, cracks were beginning to form. Cracks that would soon widen into a chasm, leading not only to the breakdown of a marriage, but to one of the most enduring mysteries in British criminal history. At first glance, Richard and Veronica Lucan seemed like the perfect society couple. He was the aristocrat with old money charm, she the elegant wife who fit seamlessly into London's glittering high society. But behind closed doors, the fairy tale was collapsing. Lord Lucan's gambling had grown from a pastime into an obsession. The Clermont Club became his second home, and his pursuit of fortune often left him chasing debts instead of collecting winnings. Money that should have supported his family was vanishing across gaming tables, and the weight of financial strain began to seep into the household. At the same time, Veronica struggled with her mental health. She suffered from bouts of depression, which placed further strain on their marriage. Tensions escalated, arguments grew sharper, and soon the relationship was poisoned with resentment and suspicion. By the early 1970s, the Lucans were living separate lives under the same roof. The breaking point came in 1972, when the marriage collapsed entirely. Veronica won custody of their 3 children, while Richard was relegated to the role of weekend visitor. To an aristocrat like Lord Lucan, this was more than a personal blow. It was a public humiliation. He believed his children should be raised under his authority, not hers, and his anger festered into obsession. He began following Veronica, documenting her behavior, and discussing with friends how he could regain custody. In the eyes of society, he was a charming earl down on his luck. But to those who knew him best, it was clear that Lucan's world was unraveling. His bitterness towards his estranged wife was deepening, and with each passing day, he seemed more determined to take drastic action to change his fate. Amid the turmoil of the Lucan household, a new figure entered the story, Sandra Rivett. Sandra was 29 years old, kind-hearted, and unassuming. She had grown up in Croydon, worked various jobs, and eventually found her place as a live-in nanny, helping families care for their children. In 1974, she accepted a position with Lady Lucan, becoming a steady presence in the Belgravia home. Sandra's role was simple, but vital. She cared for the Lucan children, while Veronica battled her depression and the fallout of her broken marriage. By all accounts, she adored the children, and they quickly grew fond of her. To them, Sandra was a source of warmth and stability in a household clouded by tension. But Sandra could not have known the dangers surrounding her new job. She stepped into a home divided by bitterness, where Lord Lucan's obsession with regaining control over his family was reaching a fever pitch. Veronica often confided in friends about her estranged husband, claiming she feared what he might be capable of. On Thursday, November 7th, 1974, Sandra was supposed to have the night off. She had plans to see her boyfriend, but he canceled, and she decided to stay in instead. That small twist of fate placed her in the Lucan household on the very night tragedy struck. As evening fell and the children were tucked into bed, Sandra made her way down to the basement kitchen to prepare tea for Lady Lucan. It was a simple, everyday act, but in the darkness below, someone was waiting. What happened next would shock Britain, destroy lives, and set in motion one of the greatest mysteries of the 20th century. The evening began like any other in the Lucan household. The children were asleep upstairs, Lady Lucan rested in her room, and Sandra Rivett slipped quietly down to the basement to make a pot of tea. The narrow stairwell was dimly lit, the air heavy with silence. But waiting in the shadows was a figure with murder on his mind. As Sandra reached the bottom of the stairs, she was struck, bludgeoned with a heavy object. The blows came fast and merciless, leaving her with no chance to cry out. In the darkness of that basement, Sandra Rivett's life was brutally ended. Moments later, Lady Veronica descended the stairs, wondering why Sandra had not returned. What she encountered was horror. Out of the darkness, she too was attacked, beaten savagely with the same weapon. Blood poured from her wounds, but in the chaos, she managed a desperate act of survival. She bit down on her attacker's fingers, forcing him to release her. Terrified and bleeding, Lady Lucan fled the house, running barefoot through the streets of Belgravia. She stumbled into the Plumber's Arms pub, her face covered in blood, crying out, "My husband's trying to kill me." Inside the pub, shocked drinkers rushed to her aid, calling the police. When officers arrived at 46 Lower Belgrave Street, they found the body of Sandra Rivett stuffed into a canvas mail sack hidden in the basement. The scene was one of unimaginable violence. But what gripped the nation was not just the murder itself, it was who Lady Lucan named as the attacker, her husband, the 7th Earl of Lucan. As police raced to Belgravia, Lord Lucan was already on the move. After the attack, he left the house and drove to the home of a close friend, Susan Maxwell Scott, in Uckfield, Sussex. It was there that he spun his version of events. Lucan claimed he had been passing by when he saw a man attacking his wife. He said he intervened, that the man fled, and that Veronica, injured and confused, was wrongly accusing him. Susan listened, but she later admitted that Lucan seemed strangely calm, almost rehearsed. He declined her offer to stay the night, instead asking her to tell his side of the story if questioned. Then, just after midnight, he slipped away into the darkness. His next movements were a mystery. By the following morning, his borrowed car, a Ford Corsair, was discovered abandoned in New Haven, near the English Channel. Inside, police found traces of blood, a piece of lead piping wrapped in tape, and evidence linking the car to the attack in Belgravia. But Lucan himself had vanished. Had he boarded a ferry to France? Had he thrown himself into the cold waters of the Channel? Or had friends in high places helped him disappear into another life? What began as a shocking murder was quickly becoming something even larger, a manhunt for a missing peer of the realm. The press seized on the story, splashing Lucan's face across every front page. Within hours, he was no longer just a suspect. He was the most wanted man in Britain. And yet, despite the search that followed, Lord Lucan would never be seen in public again. The discovery of Lord Lucan's abandoned Ford Corsair at New Haven offered detectives their first real clues. Parked near the harbor, it looked ordinary enough, until they opened the boot. Inside, they found a length of lead piping wrapped in surgical tape. It matched almost exactly the weapon used in the brutal attack at 46 Lower Belgrave Street. Blood traces and fibers inside the car provided further damning evidence. To investigators, it was clear Lucan had not stumbled upon a stranger assaulting his wife. He was the assailant. The car itself raised further questions. Why abandon it at New Haven? Had Lucan planned to cross the Channel, or was this a decoy designed to throw police off his trail? Ferry schedules that night showed no trace of him, yet the possibility that he slipped aboard unnoticed lingered. Adding to the mystery were the phone calls Lucan made before vanishing. He rang his mother, asking her to collect the children from the family home, and he spoke to friends, giving conflicting accounts of what had happened. Some described him as calm, almost detached. Others thought he sounded rattled but determined. The evidence pointed strongly towards his guilt, but it also raised an even bigger question. Was Lucan's disappearance meticulously planned, or the desperate act of a man cornered by his own crimes? Either way, by the end of that night, the Earl of Lucan had become a fugitive, leaving behind a bloodied crime scene, a grieving family, and a trail of speculation that would haunt Britain for decades. With Lord Lucan missing, Scotland Yard faced a dilemma unlike any other. They had a body, a survivor's testimony, and evidence linking Lucan to the crime, but no suspect to put on trial. The case moved forward regardless. In June 1975, an inquest into the death of Sandra Rivett was held. Lady Lucan testified, describing in chilling detail how she had been attacked by her husband and how Sandra had been murdered in her place. The blood, the pipe, the abandoned car, all of it painted a clear picture. At the end of the proceedings, the coroner delivered a verdict that stunned the nation. Lord Lucan had murdered Sandra Rivett. It was the first time in modern British history that a man of his rank, an Earl of the realm, had been formally named a murderer by a coroner's jury, without ever standing trial. This ruling carried no prison sentence, no formal conviction. Yet in the eyes of the public, the judgment was damning. Lucan was no longer simply missing. He was a killer, branded as such in the official record. Still, the greatest question remained unanswered. Where was he? The ruling only fueled speculation. Some believed Lucan had fled abroad with the help of his powerful friends, shielded by the old boy network of London's elite. Others believed his pride would never have allowed him to live in disgrace, and that he had taken his own life the very night he disappeared. But without a body, without proof, the mystery only deepened. And as the years rolled on, Lucan's name would drift from police files into the world of rumor, myth, and conspiracy. In the months and years after his disappearance, Lord Lucan became more than a fugitive. He became a legend. The police manhunt stretched across Britain, but quickly spread worldwide as rumors of sightings began to pour in. Reports placed him in France, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and even as far as India. Each alleged sighting carried the same thread: a tall, well-spoken Englishman living quietly under another name. In one case, a tourist in Melbourne swore she saw him working as a waiter. Another claimed he had been spotted in a Buddhist monastery in Bhutan. Newspapers eagerly printed every rumor, feeding a public appetite for the mystery. But time after time, the supposed Lucans turned out to be nothing more than mistaken identity. Yet some believed these weren't accidents at all. Whispers spread that Lucan's wealthy friends, fellow gamblers and aristocrats from the Clermont Club, had orchestrated his escape, that he had been spirited out of Britain on a private yacht, given money and a new life in exile. For detectives, the case was endlessly frustrating. No hard evidence, no confirmed leads, just speculation. The more time passed, the harder it became to separate fact from fantasy. And while the manhunt dragged on, the myth of Lord Lucan grew. He was no longer just a disgraced earl wanted for murder. He was a ghost, a figure who could be anywhere and nowhere all at once. The public fascination never died. People wanted to believe he was out there, living in the shadows. But others asked a darker question. Was it possible Lucan had never left New Haven at all? Nearly everyone who followed the case had a theory. The disappearance of Lord Lucan split opinion, dividing friends, police, and the public into two camps: those who believed he escaped, and those who believed he died that very night. One of the most persistent theories was suicide. Lucan, disgraced, cornered, and facing arrest for murder, may have driven to New Haven and thrown himself into the Channel. The lead pipe in his car was seen as a chilling reminder of his guilt, and some argued that his aristocratic pride would never have allowed him to live as a hunted man. Yet no body was ever recovered, and the sea, with its vast tides, could have hidden him forever. The other theory, far more sensational, was escape. Friends of Lucan at the Clermont Club, men of wealth and influence, were rumored to have helped him vanish. Some claimed he boarded a yacht that night, sailing across the Channel under a false name. Others insisted he was smuggled abroad by networks loyal to the aristocracy, given money and protection in exchange for silence. Over the decades, alleged sightings fueled the escape theory. A farmer in South Africa swore Lucan was living there under an alias. A retired policeman in Goa believed he'd met him in a bar. Even as late as the 2000s, people continued to insist they had seen the missing Earl. But with no confirmed proof, both possibilities remained shrouded in uncertainty. Suicide or escape, two paths, each equally believable, each with its own unanswered questions. What was certain, however, was that the truth died with Lord Lucan, and for his children, for Lady Lucan, and for Sandra Rivett's grieving family, the lack of closure was its own kind of torment. As the years turned into decades, the mystery of Lord Lucan refused to fade. His name became shorthand for vanishing without a trace, a ghost woven into Britain's cultural memory. For the families left behind, however, it was no legend, it was loss. Sandra Rivett's family grieved without justice, their daughter remembered only as the nanny in a tale dominated by the Earl's disappearance. Lady Veronica Lucan, scarred both physically and emotionally, raised her children alone. In later years, she spoke openly about her husband's cruelty, but she also carried the heavy burden of being forever linked to his crime. She died in 2017, still haunted by that night in Belgravia. The Lucan children grew up under the shadow of the scandal, their father a fugitive and their mother a victim. It was not until 1999 that Lord Lucan was declared legally dead, and in 2016, a death certificate was finally issued. This allowed his son George to inherit the title of 8th Earl of Lucan. Yet the questions never ended. Was Lord Lucan lying at the bottom of the Channel, claimed by the tide the night he fled? Or did he live on, quietly, under another name, watching as the world debated his fate? His case remains one of Britain's greatest unsolved mysteries, part crime, part scandal, part myth, a tale of privilege, downfall, and disappearance. Nearly half a century later, one truth endures. The man who was once Lucky Lucan slipped through history's fingers, leaving behind a story that may never be solved.